Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. With me, Priyanka Sharma. On today's episode, we focus on the escalating tensions in Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin has recognized two breakaway republics in Ukraine's east. He has also deployed Russian soldiers on so-called peacekeeping missions there. Is this the end of diplomacy in Europe? What can the West do to prevent a full-scale invasion? To discuss all this and many more insights, I'm now joined by Toomas Hendrik Ilves. He served as the President of Estonia from 2006 to 2016 and is considered a leading voice on European security. President Ilves, thank you so much for joining us on WION The World as well.
Anytime.
Right, so my first question to you regarding Vladimir Putin's speech yesterday, he recognized two breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine. Russian troops are already entering those regions. Do you think war is now inevitable?
Well, let's first of all just be clear about what we're talking about. There are no republics or breakaway republics. There are simply areas where Ukrainian law does not hold, and there are a bunch of mafioso warlords there. And secondly, there is no need to move troops into those two areas because they've been there ever since the summer of 2014, when the locals, who are really quite a minority in that area, could no longer push back against the Ukrainian army. And then Russia sent its troops in there. I mean, it's, the various events we've seen, such as the shelling of Ukraine, or even, the most famous case, of course, MH17, the civilian airliner that was shot down by Russian troops. I mean, they did that from this area that was under, that is the so-called breakaway republics that Putin now officially has sent troops into, but in fact have had troops in since the summer of 2014.
Just continuing our discussion now, within Europe, there seem to be a lot of disagreements on the topic of sanctions. If Putin had invaded outright, maybe the sanctions would have been tough. But since he's announced a half measure, how will that affect Brussels' thinking? Some, like Germany and Austria, are already having second thoughts.
Well, the ones that have been announced so far, I think, are fairly pointless since they're directed toward the DNR and LNR, which, what are you going to, those people, whatever sanctions are not going to affect them anyway, since they just are low-level mafioso. It's true that if sanctions that apply to common people will make do. The real sanctions that bite are ones that will affect the oligarchs and the people in power. Now we know even not only oligarchs, but the entire Russian leadership has massive amounts of money stored in the West. Now, why do they have money stored in the West? Because they don't trust their own country's rule of law to keep them from, to maintain their money, or that it won't be taken by the state. So they pump money all over the place. We know even from the Paradise Papers that Putin has massive amounts of money abroad, as do all kinds of other officials. How does someone like the foreign minister with a rather minor official salary rent a luxury yacht with his mistress and go sailing in the Mediterranean? Well, it's because of this kind of money now. So that real sanctions will bite down hard on the elite responsible for the current actions. And the group that we saw yesterday assembled on the Security Council, they should bear collective responsibility. So all of their holdings in the West should be frozen at this moment. And from there on in, you have the same problem with all of the laundered money in various prime spots of real estate in the world, be it the French Riviera, London, or as it's more commonly known, Londonograd, in Miami, in New York City, and bizarrely enough, in South Dakota in the US.
Arming Ukraine has been one of Europe's biggest priorities. Estonia too has shipped weapons to Kiev. But there has been one notable exception, Germany. As Europe's largest economy, does Germany's reluctance betray divisions within Europe?
Well, so far we know that both Italy and Germany have said no sanctions on energy and on cutting off SWIFT. On the other hand, the other sanctions could do a lot as well. I mean, the interesting thing is, and the moral issue is, will Germany and Italy have the courage to sanction the oligarchs and the leadership that have property on their territory? That will be the moral. I mean, you can make the argument that, well, energy, we need the energy. Okay, fine. And SWIFT, well, that would hurt our companies. But ultimately, you really have to see whether you have the courage to take a stand or not. And I suspect within the European Union, there will be quite a bit of debate over these issues in the next days.
Now, President Ilves, this conflict, in a sense, has revitalized NATO in many ways. Having said that, do you think the obsession with expanding NATO precipitated this crisis? Estonia itself joined the alliance in 2004, bringing NATO to Russia's border.
Well, no, there is no NATO obsession with expanding. And NATO has expanded only at the request of that want to join. NATO itself has no desire to expand in and of itself. The question is it open to countries or not? And so many, why do all these countries want to join NATO? But this is a complete canard, and I would really ask to avoid it. NATO is an organization run by its members. It has no urge to expand. It will expand when countries that fulfill its requirements of democratic free and fair elections, rule of law, will apply and be evaluated for the adequacy of their military to join. I mean, I think you just proof positive of this is that there is no one is asking Finland or Sweden, who would be obvious candidates strategically, to join. And that it's only about whether Finland or Sweden desires to join.
I think the bigger question is, can the NATO and Russia reach some sort of middle ground? That's what all experts and analysts are wondering at this point. Is there anything the West can offer which President Putin will be open to accepting? Because right now, both sides are not budging.
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly on arms control, I think that there's a willingness to go fairly far, say, for example, on missiles. The problem is, I mean, because we don't want missiles near Russia. But the problem is that Russia is bristling with missiles in Kaliningrad, sort of in the middle of NATO countries. And so would Russia give up its S-400s in Kaliningrad in exchange for missiles which are currently non-existent, not being stationed or placed in countries along Russian borders? I mean, there are no missiles in Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. So it's not a real hard bargain. On the other hand, I mean, those are the kinds of offers we have made. And recall, we unlike Russia, followed the NATO-Russia Founding Act and did not have permanent troops based in any of the new countries or new members of NATO. So, I mean, there was rotation of minimal numbers of troops from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I mean, basically about 500 or 600, and those would come in for 6-month periods, and then they would leave. So that's not permanent basing. Whereas, I mean, on the Russia side, that there's been no such proposal forthcoming. So I think that there is lots of room, but certainly it would be impossible to say, okay, we agree that there is no defense of the new members, or that there is no new members, or no new members will be accepted into NATO, because let's keep in mind that would also affect Finland and Sweden should they want to join, and that is a fundamental demand of the Russian side. And why that's impossible is not only a political act, I mean, sort of a fundamental position. It is that any of those steps would require a change in the North Atlantic Treaty to which all of us members have acceded. So if you want to change that, you would have to change the treaty, and then that treaty change would have to be ratified by the parliaments of all 30 members of NATO, which, let's face it, is not going to happen.
Let's now talk about the Russian president's speech. Putin repeatedly emphasized on reviving the lost Soviet glory. Does that concern states like Estonia that border Russia and were once part of the USSR?
Well, it would be if we were in the position of Ukraine, which is outside the European Union and NATO. The difference being that in the 1990s, we undertook huge and often extremely painful and politically difficult reforms that allowed us to join the European Union and NATO. And so we can be threatened, but on the other hand, once you're in NATO, you feel much more secure.
Now, some ex-Soviet countries have moved closer to Russia. We saw Putin take advantage of the recent protests in Kazakhstan and Belarus, which of course is a strong Russian ally. Do you fear at this point that Russia's growing sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union could have repercussions?
Well, in the case of, they're very separate, but in the case of Kazakhstan, I don't think it's clear even to this day what happened there. Was it a coup d'etat or was it something else? I don't know. In the case of Belarus, of course, strategically, it is somewhat worrisome to see the de facto militarization or Russification of Belarus by moving in the Russian army into Belarus. And so basically the territory from a strategic and defense point of view can be viewed as Russian territory now, not as an independent country. And then if you look at the map, you'll see that now Russia projects deep into Europe via Belarus. And especially worrisome to many is the so-called Suwalki Gap or the Suwalki Corridor, because they're between Belarus and the exclave of Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea. It's only 100 kilometers of a fairly flat land. So, that could be done in a day if you wanted to, which would then in turn, at least in terms of a land connection, cut off the Baltic countries from the rest of Europe.
President Ilves, some of the Baltic states, including Estonia, have called for more NATO presence on their soil. The idea is clearly to deter Russia to an extent, but will it be counterproductive? Sort of like poking Vladimir Putin?
No. It's our territory. If you make the argument that, well, all the 190,000 troops are on our own territory, well, then having 500 British troops on our own territory is hardly poking the Russian bear.
Do you think it's prudent to cultivate Ukraine as a neutral state or a buffer state? Would that be a better solution for NATO, Russia, and most importantly, the Ukrainian people?
Well, let's face it, Ukraine was a neutral state until 2014. Before that, it was explicitly neutral, and it was only after the invasion of Crimea and the occupation of Crimea that Ukraine ceased to be a neutral state. So this claim that, well, they should just say they're neutral and everything we find is nonsense, since it did not stop an invasion and an occupation in 2014, nor did the Budapest Memorandum, in which Russia and the UK and the United States agreed to guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange for giving up what was at the time the third largest nuclear collection of nuclear arms in the world. they did their part of the agreement, but then Russia went and invaded them anyway. So this is another reason why why Ukraine, which first of all was neutral, and secondly had this experience of a written agreement, does not trust Russia, which is completely understandable.
President Ilves, you were one of the many former heads of state who wrote a letter to the UN Secretary General during this crisis. How do you see the UN's role in this conflict? Would you say that they have been missing in action to a certain extent?
Yes. Well, I mean, they certainly have not played an active role on any of this. Rather, it's been fairly passive. But we already saw the failure of the UN to really be able to do anything when Russia violated the UN Charter in 2014 by invading and annexing the territory of Crimea. And so while we urge the UN to do something, I would say that the amount of hope there is fairly minimal.
Overall, will this crisis deepen the transatlantic defense cooperation, or will it lead to a more Eurocentric approach, as they call it? President Macron is talking about a separate EU-Russia pact. Do you see Brussels taking the lead in containing Russia?
I think the transatlantic link has been considerably strengthened, and I'm not sure how you can talk about a security cooperation between the European Union and Russia when, in fact, there is no structure within the European Union that's more than hypothetical regarding military capabilities. I mean, there is nothing. There is no. I mean, there's something called PESCO, which is a theoretically existing structure that we can combine our militaries, but there's nothing there, unfortunately. I mean, the troops, we all have our own troops, we have our own armor, our own air forces, etc. But there is no structure that would actually have any meaning as a partner in an agreement regarding security in Europe. So it's kind of a non-starter as long as Europe does not have its act together on that.
However, if NATO does not concede and Putin does not back down, where does this conflict go? Does it end with a Russian puppet regime in Kiev or a wrecked Ukraine that no longer interests NATO?
I think for that you have to interview Mr. Putin. The last thing that NATO wants is a military conflict. And I think the last thing that Ukraine wants is a military conflict. And indeed, if there is anyone who has been threatening a military conflict, it is Russia.
Let's now talk about the two breakaway regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. Are they growing the Crimean way, not recognized by the world, yet no chances of reunification? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it would require a military response. I think it's the better analogy are Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, which also are recognized by Russia and I guess 4 other authoritarian dictatorships, but that's it.
Just expanding our discussion now, there is a lot of talk of a new axis emerging with Russia and China coming closer to each other, something that concerns a lot of countries in the West. Do you think NATO is making a mistake by pushing Putin further into the opposing camp? And what do you make of China's role in this crisis?
Well, on paper, yes. In reality, that's hard to say. I've noted that China has been fairly circumspect in its comments on developments in China. In Ukraine, I'll repeat that. I noticed that China has been fairly circumspect in its first comments about the developments in Russia. And while China clearly is an authoritarian and effectively authoritarian state, it has behaved more rationally than Putin. I think you can, the West or even our neighbors like India may not always like what China does, but there is no sense of Xi Jinping being crazy. Whereas, especially after yesterday's speech, I think leaders around the world are shaking their heads and saying, is he all there?
Your fellow Baltic state, Lithuania, is embroiled in a diplomatic row with China. Beijing has imposed an unofficial embargo on them. Are you satisfied with the EU's response? Do you think Brussels should have, for that matter, impose reciprocal punitive measures?
Well, that's an ongoing process because, in fact, the internal market is holy. I mean, it would be as if China were to impose sanctions on an Indian state, right? What would India do then? You'd say, no, you don't sanction one state. And I assume India, in that case, would take countermeasures.
President Ilves, thank you so much for speaking to me on WION World is One, and thank you for all your insights.